There is a quiet tragedy that unfolds in the life of an empath, and most people never see it coming. For years, this person has been the listener, the holder of secrets, the regulator of other people's storms, the one who feels what others feel before those others even have the language for it. But what we often call empathy is not just a gift. For many, it began as a necessity. As children, they learned that love required vigilance. That safety depended on reading the room. That connection meant abandoning parts of themselves to maintain harmony. Their nervous system became exquisitely tuned to others, not because it was celebrated, but because it was required for survival. And when a child learns that their belonging depends on meeting everyone else's emotional needs, they grow into an adult who feels responsible for the emotional climate of every space they enter. At first, this looks like strength, generosity, compassion, but over time something begins to erode, because empathy without reciprocity becomes exhaustion. Care without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. Understanding without being understood becomes loneliness. The empath keeps showing up, keeps forgiving, keeps explaining away behavior that hurts them. They tell themselves they did to mean it. They are wounded. If I love them better, they will change. But the body keeps score. The nervous system does not negotiate with repeated injury. When hurt happens again and again, dismissal, manipulation, emotional unavailability, the system adapts. And eventually the same person who once overextended now begins to withdraw. Not dramatically, not vindictively, quietly. Messages go unanswered. Invitations are declined. Emotional availability shrinks. The warmth that once flowed freely now feels guarded. From the outside, people say, "You've changed." Yes, they have, but not because they stopped caring. They changed because caring cost them too much. Avoidance in this stage is not indifference. It is protection. When someone has reached the point of emotional depletion, their system moves from hyperconnection to self-preservation. What once felt like safety and closeness now feels like threat. The body remembers every time vulnerability was met with dismissal, every time openness was exploited. So it chooses distance. And here's the painful irony: the empath who once feared abandonment now becomes the one who pulls away, not because they don't long for connection, but because connection has become associated with pain. We must understand something essential here. Avoidance is not a character flaw. It is a trauma response. When a person has repeatedly overridden their own needs to maintain attachment, the psyche eventually rebels. The pendulum swings. What was once overfunctioning becomes withdrawal. What was once excessive tolerance becomes intolerance for even small violations. The system is attempting to recalibrate, but there is a danger in staying here too long. If the empath builds walls instead of boundaries, isolation replaces protection. And isolation, while temporarily soothing, deprives us of the very nourishment we require as human beings. Healing does not ask the empath to return to self-sacrifice, nor does it ask them to harden their heart. Healing asks for something far more courageous: to remain open but no longer self-abandoning, to care without caretaking, to love without losing oneself. This requires grief. Grief for the childhood where empathy was a survival strategy. Grief for relationships where giving was not matched with receiving. Grief for the years spent confusing self-neglect with compassion. Only when that grief is honored can true boundaries emerge. A boundary is not a wall. A boundary is a statement: I matter too. When the empath finally becomes avoidant, it is a signal, not of failure, not of bitterness, but of a system that can no longer tolerate self-betrayal. The task now is integration. To take the wisdom learned from pain and transform it into discernment. To recognize that not everyone is entitled to your emotional labor. To understand that your nervous system deserves safety just as much as anyone else. True compassion includes the self. And when empathy is no longer driven by fear of abandonment, but grounded in self-respect, something extraordinary happens. The empath does not disappear. They evolve. They become selective, not avoidant, grounded, not guarded, present, not depleted. They no longer chase connection, they choose it. And in doing so, they finally experience what was missing all along. Love that does not require self-erasure. That empathy as a childhood survival adaptation begins not as a virtue, but as a strategy. A child enters the world biologically wired for attachment. Survival depends entirely on the caregivers, responsiveness, attunement, and emotional availability. When those caregivers are inconsistent, overwhelmed, emotionally immature, or unpredictable, the child's nervous system adapts in order to preserve connection, because connection equals safety. In such environments, the child becomes exquisitely sensitive to tone, posture, facial expression, and subtle shifts in mood. This is not conscious. It is not a decision. It is the nervous system scanning constantly for cues of danger or disconnection. The child learns to read the room before they can read words. They detect tension in the air and adjust themselves accordingly. If mother is sad, they become soothing. If father is angry, they become quiet. If conflict arises, they become mediators. Their developing identity organizes itself around one central question: what must I be to stay connected? What we later call empathy often begins here, not as free-flowing compassion, but as hypervigilance in relational form. The child becomes attuned not because their own emotions were deeply welcomed, but because others. Emotions determine the emotional climate of the home. Their safety depended on predicting and managing those states. Over time, this ability strengthens. Neural pathways supporting emotional detection and responsiveness become refined. The child system prioritizes others' feelings over their own because that is what preserved attachment. However, there is a cost. When empathy functions primarily as adaptation, self-awareness is often underdeveloped. The child learns to track others' needs but may lose access to their own internal signals. Hunger, fatigue, anger, sadness, these experiences become secondary. They may even feel dangerous if expressing them disrupts connection. The child discovers that their authentic emotional expression risks rejection or withdrawal, so they silence themselves. They attune outward and detach inward. This outward attunement can look remarkable. Teachers may describe the child as mature beyond their years. Relatives may praise them as thoughtful, sensitive, and caring. Yet beneath that competence lies a nervous system that has learned to equate self-suppression with belonging. Empathy becomes intertwined with approval. Helping becomes synonymous with worth. The child does not feel valuable simply for existing, but for being useful, soothing, accommodating. The biology of attachment reinforces this pattern. When caregivers respond positively to the child, as caretaking behavior, smiling when comforted, relaxing when soothed, the child experiences relief. Relief registers as safety. The brain associates self-abandonment with connection. Dopamine and oxytocin pathways strengthen around pleasing and regulating others. The pattern solidifies. Over time, the child's identity fuses with the role of emotional caretaker. Yet no child is meant to carry this burden. Developmentally, children require attuned adults who can hold their emotional storms without demanding reciprocity. When that does not occur, the child overfunctions. They may become the peacekeeper in parental conflict. They may comfort a depressed parent. They may monitor siblings' moods to prevent escalation. All of this is done not out of choice, but necessity. The organism prioritizes survival over authenticity. As these children grow into adults, their empathy remains heightened. They sense shifts in energy immediately. They anticipate needs before they are spoken. They often enter helping professions or relationships where they continue regulating others. On the surface, this seems like strength, and indeed it can be a profound gift. But when empathy is rooted in fear of disconnection rather than grounded presence, it becomes exhausting. The adult empath may struggle to differentiate between compassion and responsibility. They feel compelled to fix, rescue, explain, and absorb. Boundaries feel unfamiliar because early boundaries threaten attachment. Saying no may trigger deep anxiety. Conflict may feel catastrophic rather than manageable. The nervous system still carries the imprint of early relational unpredictability. Understanding empathy as a childhood survival adaptation shifts the narrative from praise or blame to compassion. It explains why some individuals feel responsible for the emotional well-being of everyone around them. It clarifies why stepping back from others' distress can evoke guilt or panic. These reactions are not signs of weakness. They are echoes of early conditioning. Healing begins when awareness enters the picture. When the adult recognizes that their hyper-attunement once served a vital purpose, shame softens. The question changes from "what is wrong with me" to "what happened to me?" This shift opens space for self-inquiry. What do I feel when I am not managing others? What do I need when no one is watching? Can I tolerate someone else? As disappointment without collapsing into self-doubt. Gradually, empathy can evolve from survival strategy to conscious choice. The nervous system learns that connection does not require self-erasure. Boundaries become possible when safety is internal rather than externally negotiated. The individual can remain compassionate without absorbing others' emotions. They can listen without losing themselves. Empathy, when liberated from fear, becomes something different. It is no longer hypervigilant scanning. It is grounded presence. It is the capacity to witness another's pain while remaining rooted in one's own center. This transformation does not diminish empathy. It refines it, and perhaps most importantly, the former child who once survived by reading everyone else finally learns to read themselves. Their own emotions become worthy of attention, their needs become legitimate. Their existence no longer depends on constant adaptation. Empathy then ceases to be armor and becomes authentic human connection. Chronic emotional neglect and invisible trauma rarely leave visible scars. There are no bruises to point to, no dramatic incidents that outsiders can easily identify. Instead, there is absence of attunement, absence of curiosity about the child's inner world, absence of emotional mirroring that says, I see you, I feel with you, you make sense. A child can grow up in a home where food is provided, school is attended, birthdays are celebrated, and yet something essential is missing. Emotional neglect is not about what happened, it is about what did not happen. No one noticed when the child withdrew. No one asked why they seemed anxious. No one helped them name their fear, their sadness, their confusion. The child's internal experiences unfolded alone. Because children are biologically wired to preserve attachment, they do not conclude that their caregivers are unavailable. They conclude that their own needs are excessive. If a parent responds to distress with irritation, the child learns that distress is unacceptable. If vulnerability is met with silence, the child learns that emotions are burdensome. If joy is ignored, the child learns not to expect celebration. Over time, the child adapts by minimizing their internal world. They may become self-sufficient beyond their years. They may stop asking for help. They may tell themselves that nothing is wrong, even when their body carries tension, anxiety, or numbness. This adaptation protects the relationship, but it disconnects the child from themselves. Invisible trauma forms not through explosive events, but through chronic misattunement. The nervous system develops in an environment where emotional signals are not reliably received. When a child's cry does not bring comfort, their system does not simply forget. It encodes the experience as aloneness. When their excitement is not shared, their system encodes isolation. These repeated moments accumulate quietly, shaping beliefs about worth and belonging. One of the most profound consequences of emotional neglect is self-doubt. Because there is no obvious event to point to, the individual often grows up believing their pain is illegitimate. They compare themselves to others who endured overt abuse and think, I had it fine. Yet inside, there is emptiness, difficulty identifying feelings, and a persistent sense of being unseen. This is the paradox of invisible trauma. It wounds deeply while remaining socially unrecognized. The body, however, does not rely on narratives. It responds to relational environments. Chronic neglect can create hyper-independence, emotional shutdown, or heightened anxiety in relationships. Some individuals become overly accommodating, hoping to secure the attention they once lacked. Others withdraw, convinced that needing others leads to disappointment. Both patterns emerge from the same root, a system that learned early that emotional needs are unsafe or futile. Children require co-regulation. They need an adult nervous system to help organize their overwhelming states. Without this, the child must self-regulate prematurely. They distract themselves, intellectualize feelings, or numb out. What looks like maturity may actually be resignation. What looks like calm may actually be dissociation. As adults, those who experience chronic emotional neglect often struggle to access their own desires. When asked what they want, they hesitate. When asked how they feel, they offer thoughts instead of emotions. Their inner landscape feels unfamiliar because no one guided them through it. Emotional literacy was never modeled. Relationships can become particularly activating. Intimacy requires vulnerability, yet vulnerability once led to invisibility. The adult may crave closeness while simultaneously fearing it. They may overextend to maintain connection or retreat at the first sign of misattunement. Minor relational ruptures can trigger disproportionate reactions because they echo early experiences of being emotionally alone. Another hallmark of invisible trauma is the internalized belief that one must not be too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too needy. The child learned to shrink in order to preserve connection. This shrinking can persist into adulthood, limiting self-expression and authenticity. The person may excel professionally, function competently, and still carry a quiet emptiness they cannot explain. Recognizing chronic emotional neglect requires a shift in perspective. It asks us to value what was missing as much as what was present. It invites compassion for adaptations that once ensured survival. Hyper-independence was not arrogance. Emotional numbing was not coldness. People-pleasing was not weakness. These were intelligent strategies developed by a young nervous system seeking safety. Healing begins with acknowledgement. When individuals name emotional neglect, they often experience both relief and grief. Relief because their eternal struggles finally make sense. Grief because they recognize the tenderness they did not receive. This grief is not about blaming caregivers, who may themselves have been emotionally neglected. It is about honoring unmet needs. Through safe relationships, therapy, and conscious self-reflection, the nervous system can learn new patterns. Emotional experiences can be validated in real time. Feelings can be named without shame. Needs can be expressed without catastrophe. Slowly, the body begins to trust that presence is possible. Invisible trauma becomes visible first to the person who lived it. In that recognition lies power. The adult who once felt unseen can learn to witness themselves. They can develop language for their emotions. They can allow their needs to exist without apology. Chronic emotional neglect may not leave dramatic stories, but its impact is profound. When understood with compassion rather than dismissal, it reveals not deficiency, but resilience. And in that understanding, the possibility of genuine connection both with others and within oneself begins to emerge in the nervous system. Shift from hyperconnection to avoidance does not happen suddenly. It is not a personality change. It is not a moral failure. It is a biological progression that unfolds after prolonged strain. In early life, when attachment feels uncertain, the nervous system often moves toward hyperconnection. The child becomes highly attuned, relationally vigilant, constantly scanning for cues of approval or rejection. This is the fawn response in action, an adaptive strategy designed to preserve closeness at almost any cost. The body learns that safety lies in proximity and pleasing and anticipating needs before they are spoken. Hyperconnection feels like intensity. The individual texts back immediately. They over-explain. They apologize quickly. They sense shifts in tone and react before others are even aware of them. They feel responsible for relational harmony. Their system remains in a subtle state of activation, always monitoring, always adjusting. At first, this strategy works. It secures attachment. It reduces overt conflict. It creates the illusion of stability. But underneath, the nervous system is paying a price. Chronic vigilance requires energy. Constant emotional labor drains internal resources. When connection repeatedly results in hurt, betrayal, dismissal, emotional unavailability, the body begins to associate closeness with danger rather than safety. The same system that once moved toward connection begins to recalibrate. From a neurobiological perspective, the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system cannot remain activated indefinitely without consequence. Over time, if relational attempts continue to lead to pain, the system may shift into dorsal vagal shutdown. What once looked like anxious pursuit transforms into emotional withdrawal. This is not a conscious decision. It is protective physiology. Avoidance, in this context, is the nervous system as way of saying enough. The individual who once felt compelled to reach out now hesitates. Where there was urgency, there is numbness. Where there was oversharing, there is silence. This shift can confuse both the person and those around them. Friends may say, "You have changed." Partners may feel rejected, but what has actually changed is the body as tolerance for repeated relational injury. When hyperconnection fails to produce safety, avoidance feels safer. Distance reduces activation. Silence reduces vulnerability. The nervous system discovers that if it does not invest, it cannot be hurt in the same way. Emotional numbing replaces emotional flooding. Yet avoidance carries its own cost. Humans are wired for connection. When the system withdraws too completely, loneliness emerges. The individual may crave intimacy while simultaneously resisting it. They may long to be understood, yet feel exhausted by the effort of explaining themselves. This push-pull dynamic reflects an internal conflict between attachment needs and self-protection. It is important to understand that this shift is not manipulation. It is not indifference. It is adaptation layered upon adaptation. First, the body learned to survive through hyperattunement. Then, when that strategy led to depletion, it learned to survive through detachment. Both responses originate from the same core drive, preservation of the orgasm. Trauma research shows that the nervous system prioritizes safety over connection when the two feel incompatible. If closeness repeatedly triggers stress responses, the body will eventually choose distance. This may manifest as canceling plans, avoiding deep conversations, delaying replies, or feeling overwhelmed by emotional demands that once felt manageable. Internally, the experience can feel confusing. The individual may think, "I used to care so much. Why do I feel nothing now?" The answer lies not in diminished compassion, but in protective inhibition. Emotional blunting is often a shield against overwhelm. The challenge arises when avoidance becomes rigid. What begins as necessary protection can solidify into habitual disconnection. The nervous system, having learned that vulnerability equals threat, resists reopening. Even safe relationships can feel activating because the body does not easily differentiate past from present. Healing involves helping the nervous system experience connection without overwhelm. This requires relationships characterized by consistency, respect, and reciprocity. It requires pacing, small moments of vulnerability followed by positive reinforcement. It requires learning that boundaries can coexist with intimacy. The goal is not to return to hyperconnection. That state was driven by anxiety and fear of abandonment, nor is the goal to remain entrenched in avoidance. That state restricts vitality. Integration lies somewhere in between, secure connection where the individual can approach and retreat without panic. When the nervous system feels safe internally, connection becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. The person can notice relational cues without overinterpreting them. They can tolerate minor ruptures without catastrophic thinking. They can say no without fearing total abandonment. The shift from hyperconnection to avoidance is a testament to the body's intelligence. It reflects a system trying to correct imbalance rather than judging the withdrawal. We can view it as a signal that previous strategies were unsustainable. With awareness and compassionate support, the nervous system can learn a new rhythm, one that honors the need for connection while respecting the need for protection. In that balance, intimacy no longer feels like a threat, and solitude no longer feels like exile. That compassion, fatigue, and boundary collapse rarely announce themselves dramatically. They unfold quietly, almost invisibly, especially in those who pride themselves on being strong for others. The person who is always available, always listening, always understanding may not recognize the slow erosion happening within their nervous system. Compassion, in its healthy form, is a grounded capacity to witness suffering without being consumed by it. It requires empathy balanced by self-awareness. But when compassion is driven by obligation, fear of rejection, or unconscious survival patterns, it becomes something else. It becomes overextension. It becomes chronic emotional output without replenishment. Many individuals who experience compassion fatigue began as children who learned that love was conditional upon usefulness. They discovered early that being attentive, helpful, and emotionally accommodating secured connection. As adults, they carry this blueprint into friendships, partnerships, families, and even professional roles. Their identity becomes intertwined with being the reliable one. At first, this pattern is rewarded. Others praise their kindness. They are described as selfless, generous, indispensable. Yet internally, their nervous system remains in a constant state of alertness. They track other people's moods. They anticipate disappointment. They intervene before conflict escalates. Over time, this continuous output drains physiological resources. The body does not distinguish between physical labor and emotional labor. Both require energy. When someone repeatedly absorbs others, distress without adequate support, the stress response system remains activated. Cortisol and adrenaline cycle through the body. Sleep may become disrupted. Irritability increases. Small requests begin to feel overwhelming. Compassion fatigue is not a failure of character. It is the natural consequence of prolonged empathic engagement without boundaries. The individual may begin to feel numb toward problems that once moved them deeply. They may experience guilt for not caring as intensely as they once did. They may fantasize about disappearing, withdrawing, or cutting ties entirely. Boundary collapse often accompanies this fatigue. When someone has difficulty identifying where they end and others begin, they absorb responsibilities that are not theirs. They say yes when they mean no. They take on emotional burdens without assessing their capacity. They confuse closeness with constant availability. The collapse of boundaries is subtle. It may look like answering messages late into the night despite exhaustion. It may look like rearranging personal plans repeatedly to accommodate others. It may look like suppressing frustration to avoid conflict. Each small act of self-override accumulates. Over time, resentment emerges, not because the person is unkind, but because their internal needs have been chronically neglected. Resentment is often a signal that boundaries were crossed without acknowledgement. Yet those prone to compassion fatigue may judge themselves harshly for feeling it. They believe that true love requires endless patience. This belief is unsustainable. Human beings require reciprocity. The nervous system thrives on mutual regulation, not one-sided caregiving. When giving vastly outweighs receiving, depletion is inevitable. The individual may oscillate between over-involvement and sudden withdrawal. They may cut people off abruptly, after long periods of silent endurance. Physiologically, compassion fatigue can resemble burnout. There is emotional exhaustion, reduced sense of accomplishment, and detachment. However, at its core lies a relational imbalance. The person has been pouring from a reservoir that was never replenished. Without boundaries, empathy turns into self-abandonment. Restoring balance requires redefining compassion. Compassion does not mean solving. It does not mean sacrificing personal well-being. It does not mean absorbing another, as pain as proof of love. True compassion includes discernment. It recognizes that supporting someone does not require erasing oneself. Rebuilding boundaries begins internally. It involves noticing bodily cues of fatigue before they escalate, tightness in the chest, irritation at minor interruptions, a longing for solitude. These signals are not inconveniences, they are information. They indicate that capacity has limits. Learning to say no can feel threatening for someone whose identity centers on being needed. The nervous system may interpret boundary setting as risking abandonment. Anxiety can arise even when the boundary is reasonable. This reaction reflects old conditioning, not present danger. Practicing small boundaries can gradually recalibrate the system, delaying a response instead of replying instantly, declining a request without elaborate justification, allowing others to manage their own emotional reactions. Each act reinforces the truth that connection can survive limits. Compassion fatigue also invites grief. Grief for the years spent equating worth with overgiving. Grief for relationships sustained by imbalance. Grief for the exhaustion that went unnoticed for so long. Allowing that grief to surface softens self-judgment. When boundaries strengthen, compassion transforms. It becomes sustainable. The individual can remain present without feeling consumed. They can offer support while maintaining their own center. Their empathy becomes intentional rather than compulsive. Compassion, fatigue, and boundary collapse are not signs that someone cares too much. They are signs that caring has been disconnected from self-care. When empathy is reintegrated with personal limits, the nervous system stabilizes. Energy returns gradually. Resentment diminishes. In this rebalanced state, kindness is no longer fueled by fear or obligation. It flows from choice. And choice restores dignity to both the giver and the receiver. Avoidance as self-protection, not cruelty, is a truth that often goes misunderstood in relationships. When someone who was once emotionally available begins to withdraw, others may interpret the shift as coldness, rejection, or indifference, but beneath the surface, something far more complex is happening inside the nervous system. Human beings are wired for attachment. We move toward connection instinctively because connection has always meant survival. Yet when closeness repeatedly results in pain, betrayal, dismissal, or emotional overwhelm, the body recalibrates. It begins to associate intimacy with threat rather than safety. Avoidance then emerges not as punishment, but as protection. Many individuals who become avoidant did not start that way. They may have once been highly expressive, deeply empathetic, and eager to connect. They invested time, emotional energy, and vulnerability into relationships. But when those investments were met with inconsistency, criticism, or neglect, the system absorbed the impact. Each rupture left an imprint. The nervous system keeps a record of relational injury. It encodes patterns. If vulnerability repeatedly leads to shame or abandonment, the body learns to reduce vulnerability. This is not a conscious strategy. It is an automatic survival response. Just as a hand withdraws from a hot surface without deliberate thought, the psyche withdraws from relational heat. From the outside, avoidance can look abrupt. A person stops sharing personal details. They limit conversations to practical matters. They delay responding to messages. They create emotional distance where there was once openness. Observers may feel hurt or confused, but internally, the avoidant individual may be managing intense activation. Avoidance often follows a period of overextension. Someone may have tolerated boundary violations for years. They may have repeatedly explained their feelings without being heard. They may have forgiven behavior that continued unchanged. Eventually, the system reaches saturation. When efforts to repair fail, withdrawal feels like the only remaining option. It is important to distinguish avoidance from cruelty. Cruelty seeks to harm. Avoidance seeks to reduce harm to oneself. Cruelty is intentional aggression. Avoidance is protective inhibition. The individual is not necessarily trying to hurt others. They are trying to prevent further injury to their own nervous system. In many cases, avoidance is accompanied by internal conflict. The person may still care deeply. They may miss the connection. They may feel guilt for pulling away. But the body resists reopening because it anticipates more pain. This tension between longing and fear creates distance. Avoidance can also be rooted in early attachment experiences. If a child learned that expressing needs led to rejection or overwhelm from caregivers, they may have developed self-sufficiency as protection. As adults, when relationships trigger similar dynamics, that early template activates. Withdrawal feels safer than risking emotional exposure. Physiologically, avoidance often corresponds with dorsal vagal shutdown, a state characterized by emotional numbing, low energy, and reduced engagement. This state dampens the intensity of emotional experiences. It is not about not caring. It is about not being able to tolerate further stress. However, while avoidance protects in the short term, it can limit intimacy in the long term. If distance becomes rigid, opportunities for healthy connection diminish. The challenge is not to eliminate avoidance entirely, but to understand its purpose. When we approach it with curiosity rather than judgment, we create space for healing. For someone moving through avoidance, safety must be reestablished gradually. Trust cannot be demanded. It must be rebuilt through consistency, respect, and emotional reliability. Small, predictable interactions help the nervous system learn that connection does not automatically equal danger. Equally important is self-compassion. Many avoidant individuals criticize themselves harshly. They believe they are broken or incapable of intimacy, yet their withdrawal once served a vital function. It allowed them to survive relational environments that felt overwhelming or unsafe. Reframing avoidance as self-protection softens shame. It acknowledges that the system did the best it could with the information available. From this place of understanding, growth becomes possible. The individual can experiment with measured vulnerability. They can practice expressing limits instead of disappearing entirely. They can learn that boundaries and closeness can coexist. Relationships also benefit when avoidance is understood compassionately. Instead of escalating pressure, others can respond with steadiness. Instead of demanding immediate openness, they can offer patience. Co-regulation gradually replaces defensive withdrawal. Avoidance, at its core, reflects the wisdom of a nervous system seeking equilibrium. It signals that something previously felt unsafe. When we interpret it solely as rejection, we miss the opportunity to address the underlying wound. When avoidance is honored as protection rather than condemned as cruelty, it becomes easier to transform. Protection can evolve into discernment. Distance can evolve into healthy pacing. The same individual who once withdrew completely can learn to remain present while safeguarding their emotional integrity. In this transformation, connection is no longer forced nor feared. It becomes intentional, balanced, and grounded in mutual respect. Healing through self-compassion and conscious boundaries begins with a fundamental shift in perspective. For many who have lived in patterns of overgiving, hyper-attunement, or emotional self-sacrifice, the instinct is to look outward for repair. They believe the healing will come when others finally understand, finally change, finally reciprocate. But real healing starts internally in the relationship one has with oneself. Self-compassion is often misunderstood. It is not self-pity. It is not indulgence. It is the courageous act of turning toward one's own pain with the same gentleness that was so freely offered to others. For individuals who learned early that their worth depended on usefulness, this can feel unfamiliar, even threatening. The nervous system may equate self-focus with selfishness, yet without self-compassion, every attempt at change becomes harsh and unsustainable. When someone has spent years overriding their own needs, the first step in healing is simply noticing. Noticing exhaustion without judgment. Noticing resentment without shame. Noticing the tightness in the chest when saying yes, while wanting to say no. These observations are acts of reconnection. They signal that the internal world matters. Self-compassion creates safety within. It allows the person to acknowledge, of course I am tired. Of course I feel hurt. Of course I learned to survive this way. This tone of understanding calms the stress response. The nervous system softens when it is not being attacked from within. Healing cannot occur in an atmosphere of internal criticism. However, self-compassion alone is not enough. Without conscious boundaries, empathy will continue to flow outward without containment. Boundaries are the behavioral expression of self-respect. They define where one person ends and another begins. They are not punishments, they are clarity. For someone accustomed to boundary collapse, establishing limits can feel destabilizing. The body may respond with anxiety when declining a request. There may be fear of disappointing others or losing connection. These reactions often echo earlier attachment experiences where love felt conditional. Recognizing this historical imprint helps separate past fear from present reality. Conscious boundaries are intentional rather than reactive. They arise from awareness of capacity rather than from sudden burnout. Instead of waiting until resentment erupts, the individual checks in with their internal state beforehand. Do I have the energy for this conversation? Do I genuinely want to commit to this plan? Am I agreeing out of care or out of fear? The practice of pausing before responding is transformative. It interrupts automatic people-pleasing. It gives space for authentic choice. Even a simple statement like, let me think about it, can create room for discernment. Over time, this pause rewires relational patterns. Boundaries also require communication. Expressing limits clearly and calmly strengthens relational integrity. I am not available tonight. I need some time to myself. That does tea work for me. These statements may feel uncomfortable at first, but they are acts of alignment. They reduce the gap between inner truth and outer behavior. Self-compassion supports this process by soothing the guilt that often follows. Guilt does not necessarily mean wrongdoing. For those conditioned to prioritize others, guilt may simply indicate growth. Meeting that guilt with kindness prevents regression into old habits. Healing through boundaries does not mean becoming rigid or detached. It means engaging from a regulated place. When limits are honored, compassion becomes sustainable. The individual can offer presence without depletion, because their giving is grounded in choice rather than compulsion. Another essential element is grief. As boundaries strengthen, there may be recognition of relationships that were maintained primarily through overextension. Some connections may shift or fall away. Allowing space for sadness without self-blame is part of integration. Grief acknowledges that growth can alter relational dynamics. Over time, self-compassion and boundaries begin to reinforce one another. The more kindly one treats oneself, the easier it becomes to protect one's energy. The more consistently boundaries are upheld, the safer the internal environment feels. This reciprocal strengthening stabilizes the nervous system. Physiologically, when a person feels empowered to say no, stress activation decreases. The body no longer braces for inevitable overcommitment. Rest becomes restorative rather than guilty. Solitude becomes nourishing rather than isolating. Connection becomes mutual rather than draining. Healing is not about abandoning empathy. It is about including oneself within it. The individual who once scanned every room for others needs begins to scan inward with equal attention. They ask, what do I feel? What do I need? What aligns with my well-being? This inward attunement restores wholeness. In the presence of self-compassion and conscious boundaries, relationships transform. They become partnerships rather than performances. Reciprocity replaces silent sacrifice. Respect replaces resentment. The journey is gradual. There will be moments of relapse into old patterns. There will be discomfort as new limits are tested. Yet each act of alignment strengthens internal trust. Healing, ultimately, is the return to balance. A balance where empathy flows outward without erasing the self, where connection thrives alongside autonomy, where kindness includes the one who offers it.